Welcome to a story where survival is not a theory, but a choice made under collapsing stars. Tonight, you will follow Daniel, a former bartender from Arizona, who left behind an ordinary life and found himself steering a dying ship through radiation storms, reactor meltdowns, and impossible decisions. This is not just a journey across space. It is a test of who a person becomes when escape is easier than courage. Stay with us and step into the storm. Metal shrieked as the hull flexed under tidal strain, warning lights strobing crimson across the cockpit. Daniel's harness bit into his shoulders while the ship spun through a collapsing gravity well, fragments of shattered satellites flashing past like shrapnel. Outside, a dying star folded inward, its surface tearing open in silent white fury. The navigation grid dissolved into static. "Manual!" Lyra snapped, her blue skin pulsing as she rerouted power with trembling precision. Daniel seized the controls, fingers slick with sweat, and forced the nose toward a narrow distortion seam forming ahead. Radiation hammered the shields. Numbers spiked beyond safe thresholds. The ship bucked, metal cracking somewhere deep in its spine. Daniel gritted his teeth and rode the turbulence, counting breaths, adjusting thrust in microbursts. The seam flickered, shrinking. He pushed the engines past redline. The vessel lunged forward as the star imploded behind them, gravity snapping shut like jaws. Silence settled over the cockpit in thin, brittle layers as the alarms finally died. Daniel's pulse still thundered in his ears, echoing against the curved glass of the viewport where distant stars steadied into cold pinpoints. He flexed his trembling fingers above the controls, smelling burnt circuitry and ozone. For a moment, he wasn't in deep space. He was back in Arizona, behind the sticky counter of the Cactus Cantina, wiping the same ring of dried cola from varnished wood while neon beer signs hummed overhead. Back then, the loudest threat was boredom. The most dangerous thing he faced was regret. He had stared at the desert through the bar window and wondered if life was supposed to feel smaller every year. Now the universe had nearly crushed him between collapsing gravity fields, and the memory of that quiet bar felt unreal. Ordinary had once terrified him. Today, survival demanded something far more brutal than routine. A sharp burst of static tore through the cockpit speakers, snapping Daniel back to the present. The ship's damaged comm array flickered, struggling to lock onto a fragmented transmission bleeding across emergency frequencies. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she amplified the signal. Through waves of distortion, a voice broke apart in gasps, coordinates repeating, oxygen failing, atmospheric toxicity critical. Visual telemetry followed, a colony transport, half buried on a storm-racked planet orbiting a volatile gas giant, radiation levels rising, structural integrity collapsing. Survivors estimated under 20. Daniel stared at the projected trajectory overlay. The planet lay just outside their safe corridor, its magnetosphere unstable. Solar winds shredding anything that lingered too long. Fuel reserves would be tight. One wrong calculation meant no return path. Lyra didn't look at him when she said, "If we ignore this, they die." The stars outside seemed suddenly indifferent. Daniel exhaled slowly, already running numbers in his head, knowing this choice would cost more than fuel. The planet's upper atmosphere struck like liquid fire. Corrosive particles scraped across the hull, sizzling against the outer membrane as warning glyphs cascaded over the cockpit display. Daniel angled the ship nose down, threading through violent crosswinds that twisted the descent corridor into a spiraling chute. Lightning arced sideways through toxic clouds, illuminating churning layers of green and violet gas. Shield integrity dropped by single digits with every second. Lyra rerouted power from non-essential systems. Gravity dampeners flickered, threatening to fail. The hull vibrated under sustained chemical assault, tiny fractures spidering outward across structural struts. Daniel adjusted thrust in controlled pulses, compensating for wind shear that shoved the ship off vector. Below, the surface appeared unstable, patches of bubbling terrain and shifting ridges like muscle beneath skin. "Landing window closing," Lyra warned. Daniel committed. The ship plunged through the final cloud layer, alarms peaking as corrosion ate deeper into their defenses. The ramp hissed open into air that looked solid enough to bruise. Wind rolled across the surface in low, invisible waves, carrying fine corrosive particles that pinged against their suits like microscopic shrapnel. Daniel stepped down first, boots sinking slightly into ground that felt alive, soft, shifting, unstable. His visor display flickered as atmospheric interference distorted sensor readings. Oxygen levels were technically breathable with filtration, but toxins spiked unpredictably. A distant tremor rippled through the terrain, sending a pulse beneath his feet, as if something massive had turned over underground. Lyra moved beside him, scanning the horizon, where fractured metallic structures pierced the haze, the remains of the colony dome. The wind changed direction without warning, striking from behind with sudden force, pushing them forward. Daniel braced, anchoring his boots magnetically. Every gust carried static discharge, crackling along their suit seams. The planet wasn't loud, it was watchful. The habitat dome rose from the shifting terrain, like a cracked bone jutting through poisoned flesh. Half its surface had collapsed inward, transparent panels warped and blackened by corrosive storms. Daniel forced open a secondary hatch, its hinges shrieking in protest. A rush of stale air rolled out, thin, metallic, laced with failing filtration residue. Inside, emergency lights blinked weakly over overturned cots and scattered supply crates. Survivors huddled near a flickering generator core, faces gray beneath dust-streaked visors. Oxygen concentration hovered at barely survivable levels. One woman coughed violently. Her mask seal cracked. Lyra moved fast, distributing portable filters while Daniel stabilized the failing atmospheric scrubber with a manual bypass. The structure groaned as another wind pulse struck, microfractures splintering across the dome's upper arc. The colony's main reactor signature pulsed erratically beneath the floor grid. If containment failed, this entire valley would become a crater. The storm returned without warning. Pressure readings spiked, and the fractured dome shuddered as horizontal lightning tore across the valley. Daniel sealed the portable oxygen crates and signaled the survivors to move. The ground outside churned, slick with corrosive runoff. Wind slammed into them, forcing the group to stagger in a tight formation toward the ship's faint beacon pulsing through toxic haze. Debris lifted from the surface, metal fragments, shattered panels, whipping past like blades. One colonist fell, mask dislodged, choking instantly. Daniel dropped to one knee, locking his suit's reserve valve to her line, hauling her upright despite the drag of gravity fluctuations. Lyra covered their flank, her suit emitting a localized field to deflect particulate burn. Thunder cracked overhead, the sound delayed by dense atmosphere. Every step felt stolen from the planet itself. Behind them, the broken dome folded inward under sustained wind shear. A sharp tremor rippled through the valley as Daniel's wrist display flared with a new alert. Beneath the fractured dome, the colony's fusion reactor pulsed in unstable intervals. Containment levels dropping with each surge of atmospheric interference. Lyra accessed the remote diagnostics, and her expression hardened. Magnetic confinement was degrading. The storm's electromagnetic spikes were corrupting the stabilizer lattice. If the core breached, the blast would vaporize everything within kilometers, including their ship. Daniel glanced back at the remaining survivors, still scrambling across the corrosive plain. Evacuating them meant delaying departure. Delaying meant absorbing another surge. The reactor's output spiked again, lighting the shattered dome from within like a dying sun. Struggling to ignite. "We can't outrun that detonation," Lyra said over the rising wind. Daniel recalculated thrust margins. Their engines were already strained from descent. Leaving now might save them. Staying could save everyone, or end them all. The cargo hold filled faster than the mass index could tolerate. Daniel watched the load calculations climb into red as the last survivors staggered aboard. Coughing behind cracked visors, structural stress indicators blinked along the inner hull frame. Propulsion efficiency dropped with every additional kilogram. Lyra sealed the ramp while storm winds howled against the exterior, sand and acid striking in relentless sheets. The reactor pulse beneath the valley intensified, sending faint vibrations through the landing struts. Daniel ran projections. With current weight, ascent velocity would be insufficient to clear the blast radius if detonation occurred mid-lift. Someone would have to stay. The realization settled heavy and cold. Survivors crowded the bulkhead, eyes wide, searching his face for certainty. Outside, lightning crawled across the sky like veins. Daniel swallowed. Knowing leadership meant choosing which lives were carried upward and which were left to chance. Panic fractured discipline the moment Daniel ordered weight redistribution. A colonist with bloodshot eyes shoved past the others and lunged for the manual override panel near the airlock. "We launch now!" he shouted, fingers flying across controls he barely understood. The system rejected his input, but the forced access attempt triggered a cascade. Life support rerouted. Internal pressure fluctuating violently. Warning tones erupted through the hold. Oxygen mix destabilized. Survivors began shouting, some clawing toward the hatch in blind terror. The storm outside intensified, slamming debris against the hull like artillery. Daniel crossed the deck in 3 strides and yanked the man away from the panel, slamming him against the bulkhead before the override could disengage stabilizers. The impact reverberated through metal ribs albedo under strain. Lyra sealed secondary controls remotely, locking the ship into manual command authority. Fear had become another hostile force, just as lethal as the planet outside. Another seismic shock tore through the valley, lifting the ship half a meter before slamming it back onto unstable ground. Internal supports groaned. A section of ceiling plating in the cargo corridor buckled inward, shearing loose in a rain of sparks and fractured alloy. Daniel turned at the sound, just as a structural beam tore free from its housing and hurtled toward him. Lyra moved without hesitation. She shoved him aside, the beam grazing her shoulder as it crashed into the deck behind them. Her suit's outer layer split open along the impact line, corrosive air hissing through the breach before emergency seals clamped shut. Radiation levels spiked across her HUD. She staggered, but remained upright, jaw clenched against pain. Daniel grabbed her arm, feeling heat through the suit's insulation. Outside, the storm roared louder, as if sensing weakness. The reactor pulse beneath the surface quickened. Daniel sealed Lyra into the medical brace and sprinted to the cockpit as the ship's systems convulsed. He slammed the ignition sequence. Nothing. The propulsion core coughed once, then flatlined. Power rerouted automatically to life support, starving the engines of the minimum charge needed for vertical thrust. Outside, the storm thickened into a wall of corrosive haze, visibility collapsing to near zero. The landing struts began to sink as the ground beneath liquefied under seismic tremors. Daniel bypassed the automated safeguards, attempting a raw start, fuel injectors whining, plasma coils straining beyond tolerance. The console flickered, then went dark for a full second that felt endless. When the displays returned, red warnings dominated the screen. Core instability, ignition failure, ascent probability negligible. The reactor pulse beneath the valley surged again, a deep vibration traveling up through the hull. They weren't lifting off. They were running out of time. Emergency lighting dimmed to a low amber pulse as auxiliary power reserves dropped below 20%. The cockpit felt smaller in the half-dark, shadows stretching across fractured panels and flickering displays. Daniel sat motionless, hands resting on dead controls, listening to the faint hum of life support, struggling to maintain breathable pressure. Outside, the storm raged unseen, its force transmitted through the hull in deep, bone-level vibrations. Each tremor carried the distant throb of the failing reactor beneath the valley. His breath fogged the inside of his visor, steady but heavy. He closed his eyes for a moment and heard another sound layered beneath the chaos: neon buzzing, glass clinking, the slow drag of a bar towel across polished wood. Arizona. Safe. Small. Meaningless. He had once feared dying without living. Now survival demanded something harsher than escape. It demanded decision. Lyra's voice cut through the dim cockpit, thin but steady over internal comms. She had overridden the medical brace restraints and pulled herself upright despite the radiation warnings flashing across her display. "Daniel," she said, breath uneven. "Survival is not only about leaving." The reactor pulse below surged again, rattling loose panels in the ceiling. Daniel stared at the tactical projection. Detonation curve steep, ascent probability collapsing toward zero. He could still attempt launch with minimal mass, abandon the remaining colonists, outrun the blast. The numbers favored selfish logic, but the faces in the cargo hold, dust-streaked, terrified, trusting, refused to disappear. Lyra's silver eyes held his through the feed, pain evident, yet unyielding. "Who do you become?" she asked quietly, "when there is no one watching?" The storm roared, indifferent. Daniel felt the weight of the question settle heavier than gravity itself. Daniel opened his eyes, and the hesitation was gone. He rerouted remaining auxiliary power from propulsion to containment diagnostics, ignoring the alarms that protested the imbalance. The reactor's magnetic lattice below flickered erratically. Manual stabilization was still possible. From inside the core chamber, exposure levels would exceed survivable thresholds within minutes. He switched the internal command lock to Lyra's biometric signature, sealing her out of the reactor corridor. "No!" Her voice snapped through comms, sharp with fear and fury. But the override held. Daniel stood, feeling the ship tremble beneath his boots as another seismic pulse rolled through the valley. In the cargo hold, survivors clung to bulkheads, unaware of the choice being made above them. He paused only once, hand hovering over the door release. Survival was not escape. It was responsibility. He keyed the corridor open and stepped toward the radiation glow rising through the deck plates. The reactor chamber door sealed behind Daniel with a hollow clang that echoed through the narrow corridor. Heat radiated through layered plating, turning the air inside his suit thick and metallic. The core loomed ahead, a sphere of unstable light suspended within a trembling magnetic lattice. Containment coils flickered, arcing white-blue across warped support struts. His visor display flooded with radiation warnings. Safe exposure limits were already exceeded. He moved anyway. Each step felt heavier as gravity fluctuated under magnetic distortion. The floor plates vibrated with a low, predatory hum. He reached the manual control interface, a scorched panel half melted by power surges, and tore away the damaged cover. Sparks bit into his gloves. The reactor pulsed brighter, reacting to atmospheric interference from the storm above. Daniel forced steady breaths and began recalibrating coil alignment by hand, adjusting oscillation intervals in microseconds, while the chamber temperature climbed toward lethal. The containment lattice flickered out of phase, magnetic lines collapsing into chaotic interference. Daniel stared at the oscillation graph, dancing erratically across his visor. The storm's electromagnetic pulses were desynchronizing the reactor's harmonic balance. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing panic down. Rhythm. Everything had rhythm. The reactor wasn't exploding randomly. It was misaligned. He adjusted the modulation interface manually, tapping recalibration sequences in steady intervals, matching the pulsing glow of the core like counting beats in a song. The first attempt failed. A shockwave slammed him against the console, cracking the inner layer of his suit. He staggered upright and tried again, refining the timing by microseconds. The reactor's roar shifted, less chaotic, more coherent. Light stabilized into a narrower band. Sweat pooled inside his helmet. The rhythm held, for now. The reactor's glow narrowed from blinding white to a fierce, controlled blue. Oscillation lines aligned across Daniel's visor, stabilizing into clean, synchronized waves. The violent tremor beneath the chamber softened into a steady vibration. Magnetic containment reasserted itself, locking the fusion core into balance just as pressure readings peaked beyond catastrophic thresholds. Daniel's knees buckled, but he kept one hand pressed to the console, maintaining the harmonic interval he had forced into alignment. Outside the chamber walls, the storm howled and lightning struck again. Yet the reactor no longer answered with chaotic surges. Instead, its pulse matched his measured cadence. Radiation exposure warnings flashed crimson across his display. Internal suit layers were degrading. He disengaged the manual override only after automated systems confirmed full stabilization. The detonation curve vanished from the projection grid. The valley would not become a crater. Not today. The moment containment stabilized, Lyra slammed power back into propulsion. The engines answered with a guttural roar, uneven but alive. Daniel stumbled into the cockpit, radiation alarms still screaming in his suit, as the ship's mass thrusters ignited in staggered bursts. Outside, corrosive winds battered the hull, trying to pin them back into the valley. The landing struts tore free from liquefying ground as thrust vectors fought gravity spikes rippling through the storm. Daniel collapsed into the pilot harness and forced manual ascent, micro-adjusting pitch to compensate for unstable air density. Plasma exhaust carved a temporary corridor through toxic clouds, only for it to close violently behind them. Structural stress indicators blinked at critical thresholds. The ship climbed meter by meter, engines whining in protest. Below, lightning forked across the shattered dome like grasping fingers. But the vessel punched upward through corrosive layers, clawing for orbit. Daniel's vision blurred as radiation warnings escalated to terminal red. His suit's internal regulator struggled to compensate. Oxygen mix thinning with every breath. Lyra tore herself free from the medical brace. Ignoring the pain radiating through her injured shoulder, she crossed the cockpit in 3 unsteady steps and connected her suit's auxiliary life support line directly into his failing intake port. The transfer began instantly, siphoning her remaining reserves into his system. "Focus," she whispered. Steady despite the tremor in her voice, the ship shuddered as another turbulence wave struck, throwing them sideways in their harnesses. Daniel forced his eyes open, gripping the controls while Lyra manually stabilized their ascent vector one-handed. Her oxygen levels dropped into caution range, but she didn't disengage. Outside the viewport, corrosive clouds thinned into streaks of violet light. Survival demanded more than strength. It demanded refusal to let go. The final cloud layer tore apart around them in a violent shimmer of violet and green. Pressure readings dropped sharply as the ship punched through the upper atmosphere. Corrosive impacts faded into scattered pings along the hull. Daniel felt the sudden lightness of reduced gravity. His harness, the only thing keeping him upright, as adrenaline bled from his system. Below, the storm churned like a living wound, lightning crawling across the planet's surface in slow, jagged veins. The engines stabilized into a steadier burn. Though heat signatures still flared dangerously close to overload, Lyra disengaged her oxygen line only after his suit indicators returned to minimal survival thresholds. Silence expanded in the cockpit, broken only by labored breathing and distant structural creaks. They had cleared the blast radius. The valley remained intact. Reactor stable. Daniel's vision dimmed at the edges as orbit captured them. Daniel woke to the low hum of orbital stabilizers and the sterile scent of med gel sealing burns along his arm. The cockpit was dark, emergency lighting replaced by soft white strips running along the ceiling. He tried to move and felt resistance, his right arm heavier. Unfamiliar. He turned his head slowly and saw polished alloy where flesh should have been. Biomechanical joints flexing in precise silence. Memory returned in fragments. Reactor light. Radiation surge. Lyra's oxygen line feeding into his suit. He inhaled carefully. Pain answered, but did not overwhelm. Outside the viewport, the planet drifted below, its storms reduced to distant spirals. The survivors' shuttle had already detached, transmitting gratitude across secure channels. Daniel flexed metal fingers experimentally. They responded instantly. He had stabilized the reactor. He had lived. The cost rested at the end of his shoulder, gleaming under ship light. Daniel stood before the reflective panel in the medical bay, studying the man staring back at him. Fine streaks of silver threaded through his dark hair. Radiation scars faintly tracing along his collarbone like pale lightning. The prosthetic arm rested seamlessly at his side, its alloy surface matte and functional rather than ornamental. When he flexed it, internal servos whispered with mechanical precision. It was stronger than the limb he had lost, more resilient, yet undeniably foreign. Lyra stepped in behind him, her injured shoulder bound in regenerative mesh, her gaze steady. She did not speak. She did not need to. Survival had marked them both. Daniel touched the scar along his neck, where the suit had failed, feeling the memory more than the pain. He had stabilized a dying star and a collapsing reactor, but the universe had claimed its price in return. The comm array realigned slowly, antennas extending from the hull like fragile ribs against the darkness of orbit. Daniel seated himself at the console, his prosthetic fingers moving with deliberate precision across encrypted channels. Lyra entered the coordinates of the hidden orbital station where Mira and Orion waited under autonomous protection protocols. Static filled the speakers at first. Then a flicker of signal strength climbed steadily upward. Daniel held his breath as the screen stabilized. Two small figures appeared in the transmission frame. Eyes wide, alive. Their voices overlapped in relieved excitement, unaware of how close the storm had come to stealing everything. Daniel kept his tone calm, steady, offering only what they needed to hear. Behind him, the scarred planet drifted silently. He ended the call only after confirming the station's integrity. They had survived, but the distance between them felt heavier now. Daniel recalculated the jump vector 3 times before committing. Fuel reserves hovered just above minimum threshold, the propulsion core still bearing scars from the emergency burn through the corrosive atmosphere. Lyra monitored structural integrity from the secondary console. Her injured shoulder stabilized, but not fully healed. The survivors' shuttle had already disappeared into deeper space, leaving their vessel alone in quiet orbit above the storm-torn planet. Daniel initiated the return sequence toward Earth's sector, routing power carefully to avoid another overload cascade. The ship's navigation grid shimmered as probability corridors formed ahead. Thin, precise, unforgiving. One misalignment would scatter them across unstable gravitational eddies. He flexed his prosthetic hand once, grounding himself in its steady mechanical certainty. The stars stretched into elongated streaks as the jump engines primed. This time, survival was not about rescue. It was about getting home intact. During the long transit window between jump corridors, silence settled into something almost gentle. Daniel leaned back in the pilot harness, watching distant star fields drift across the viewport. Lyra placed a small metallic container beside him, condensation forming along its chilled surface. Inside, carbonated earth cola shimmered under ship light. "For calibration of morale," she said quietly. Daniel allowed himself the faintest smile. He lifted the container and took a careful sip. The familiar sting of carbonation spread across his tongue, sharp and absurdly ordinary against the backdrop of cosmic radiation scars and biomechanical limbs. For a moment, he was back in Arizona, behind a wooden counter. Life simple and small. The taste lingered longer now, heavier with memory. Lyra studied him as he swallowed. Survival had changed the flavor of everything, even something as trivial as sugar and bubbles. Mira and Orion drifted into the cockpit during the final approach corridor, their small forms silhouetted against streaking stars. Daniel lowered the navigation sensitivity and motioned them closer. His prosthetic fingers rested lightly over the control array as he spoke without turning fully toward them. He did not describe radiation burns or reactor chambers. Instead, he explained probability, how every decision carries weight, how survival sometimes means staying when escape is easier. Orion's silver hair caught the dim light as he asked whether it had been frightening. Daniel answered honestly, "Yes, fear is constant. What matters is what you choose while it's present." Mira studied the alloy of his arm, understanding more than he said. Outside, gravitational currents shimmered as the ship aligned for Earth's sector. Lessons in survival were not abstract. They were written in scars and restraint. Earth rose slowly across the forward viewport, a blue arc cutting through the black. Daniel reduced thrust and let orbital capture guide the ship into a wide, stable path. Cloud systems spiraled in delicate patterns, oceans reflecting sunlight in quiet bands of silver. From this distance, the planet looked untouched, no storms ripping continents apart. No reactors threatening detonation, just atmosphere and water suspended in improbable balance. Mira pressed her hand against the glass, breath fogging the surface. Orion hovered beside her, eyes tracking coastlines that meant little to him, but everything to his father. Daniel felt the old gravity of memory pull at him. Desert heat, neon lights, the scent of varnished wood and spilled cola. Earth had not changed. It had never known how close he had come to not returning. The ship maintained silent orbit, systems steady, survivors far behind them. Mira traced the curve of a continent with her fingertip against the viewport, her blue-tinged skin faintly luminescent in the dim cockpit light. Orion leaned forward beside her, silver hair drifting weightless as the ship held orbital drift. "It looks fragile," he murmured, studying the thin atmospheric glow encircling the planet. Daniel stood behind them, one alloy hand resting gently on the back of Mira's shoulder. He watched their reflections layered over Earth's surface, children born between stars, yet drawn instinctively toward the world that shaped him. They had seen dying suns and corrosive storms, but this quiet sphere seemed to hold a different gravity. Lyra observed them silently, understanding that belonging was not about origin, but about choice. The ship's instruments ticked steadily, tracking orbital stability. For the children, Earth was a story. For Daniel, it was the beginning of one. Daniel stood alone at the helm as Earth slowly rotated beneath them. His reflection in the glass carried silver in his hair and alloy in place of flesh, a visible ledger of survival. The navigation grid shimmered softly, awaiting his decision. Behind him, Mira and Orion laughed quietly, their voices steady, alive. Lyra's presence hovered close, not touching, but certain. He rested his mechanical hand over the ignition controls and studied the blue planet one last time. Once, he had feared dying without ever living. Now he understood that living meant choosing, again and again, who he would be when fear pressed hardest. Earth had given him ordinary beginnings. The stars had demanded more. Daniel set a new course away from orbit, engines rising in controlled resonance. The ship turned toward deep space, carrying scars, memory, and a man who had chosen. Daniel survived, but survival left its mark. A mechanical arm, silver in his hair, and a deeper understanding of what it means to choose responsibility over fear. This story reminds us that the universe does not define us. Our decisions do. Thank you for listening. If you were moved by this journey among the stars, follow the channel and join us for more cinematic sci-fi survival stories, where every choice has a cost.